Well, greetings to you today. It is Sunday, the 9th of May, and here in Canada and the USA, it's a celebration of Mother's Day. Now, I know in Britain and in other parts of the world, Mother's Day was celebrated much earlier than this, but here in this continent, it is today, Sunday, the 9th of May. I trust you're doing well, and obviously my theme today is going to be Mother. Now, I want to pay tribute to my wife, who is not my mother, but she is the mother of our children. And what a wonderful mother of God, or mother in God, if you like, to our family. Thank you, Pat. May the Lord richly bless you today and always. Hear the word of the Lord from 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 to 7, but particularly verse 5. Here is the word of the Lord. I thank God, whom I serve as my forefathers did, with a clear conscience. As night and day I constantly remember you in my prayers, recalling your tears. I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy. I have been reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and am persuaded that now lives in you. For this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God did not give us the spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power, of love, and of self-discipline. This is the word of the Lord and the words of the Apostle Paul to young Timothy. Particularly verse 5, where we read these words again. I have been reminded of your sincere faith, speaking to Timothy, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I'm persuaded now lives in you also. Now for this reason, fan into flame the gift of God. Your grandmother, your mother were not timid people. They were powerful people. They were people full of love and full of self-discipline. And that, Timothy, is what will be in you also. I want us to think about this train, this movement, this generational influence that we need to pay close attention to. Lois, that name means good or better. Eunice, that name is the feminine version of the male unique, not unique with a Q, but unique with a Nike, which means good, from which we get the word Nike, which means victory or the upper hand. So every time you pull on those running shoes, and that particularly if they're Nikes, you remember Eunice. You remember Lois. You remember the story of Timothy. On this Mother's Day, it is always good to remember where we came from. The Apostle Paul places heavy emphasis on the value of young Timothy because he would then carry the ministry of the gospel after Paul's race was done, and the value of the grandmother Lois and the mother Eunice. In fact, when we read this passage and we come to the portion which says, for this reason, what reason? The reason that Lois and Eunice set a great example. Now, I know that you may be watching this today and you perhaps do not have great examples in your lineage. Well, let's start with you now. Let's start to be that example so that generations to come will benefit greatly from your faithfulness and your love. It is obvious that these people put into young Timothy at an early age. Scripture actually proves that. 2 Timothy 3 verse 15 says, from childhood, Timothy, you have been acquainted with the sacred writings which are able to make you wise for salvation through Jesus Christ. So from childhood, somebody was influencing you. Augustine had his saintly mother, Monica. John Wesley had his saintly mother, Susanna. Billy Graham had a saintly mother, Morrow Coffey. John the Baptist, a saintly mother in Elizabeth. And Jesus, that saintly mother, Mary. Now, going back to the reference about Timothy's mother and grandmother, I was thinking about Jesus. Now, I'm going to take a little liberty here, but I think I've reached an age where I can do that without damaging the scripture. We're all familiar with Mary, the mother of Jesus, although I must say Protestants need to warm up to her more than we actually do. She, according to the scripture, is blessed amongst women. Luke chapter 1, verse 28. Listen to these words. And the angel came to her and said, Hail thou that art highly favored. The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. But have you ever stopped to think about who her mom was? In other words, have you ever wondered who Jesus's granny was? Now, I want to be very careful here. If Timothy had his mother Eunice and his grandmother Lois, then Jesus had his mother Mary and his grandmother who? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us who that is, but there are writings, the apocryphal writings, do refer to a lady by the name of Anne in the Greek derivative, or Hannah in the Hebrew. So Granny Hannah would have been the grandmother of Jesus. Now, before you take me out and stone me, or before you take me out and throw me outside the city wall, let me just tell you, we learn much from the intertestamental or the apocryphal or the other writings that provide wonderful context for us to any mind that goes, who was the grandmother of Jesus? Now you might say, well, why is that important? Well, let's just continue this thought. If we're going to talk about a Lois and a Eunice, we might as well talk about a Mary and an Anne or a Hannah. Granny Hannah was married to Granddad Joachim. They were the parents of the Virgin Mary, and tradition tells us that while they did not originally come from Jerusalem, they did set up home near the Sheep's Gate in Jerusalem. And that is most likely where Mary would have been born. Now, listen. All I want to do today is to help us understand that Jesus was all God, and that Jesus was also all man. He lived like us, he grew up like us, and even though we don't have much of a record about him after his birth until he was the age of 12, when he suddenly appeared reading the scripture in the holy place, after that we have no more record of him again until age 30, when he appears to walk the earth with those disciples for 3 years before his crucifixion. Now, there's quite a gap in all of that time. What was he doing? I would like to think that the fact that he was all man, that he was also a toddler, he was a teenager, my mind can even go so far as for Mary to talk to him and say, now listen, Jesus, your Granny Hannah is going to come over here and babysit you for a couple of hours. I have a few things to do. I've got to run some errands. You know what? Can you not picture that with me? If I'm the only one, then I'll receive the emails. But you know what? I just love to think about godly influence. I love to think that influence not only comes from the mother and the father, but it comes from the grandmother and the grandfather and the great-grandmother and the great-grandfather. And remember that influence will come from all of these people, whether it's good or bad. And there are many people in our world today who are suffering in their own generation because the generations before them failed to instill great truth and fail to instill values of strong ethical and moral proportion. I think it's one of the reasons why we might be in quite a precarious condition today. There are gaps. We talk about building Sunday school again in our churches. We talk about building Christian education, and we're not going to be building from the previous generation who have stopped attending and stopped going and stopped even believing. We're having to go back now 2 generations to find some bedrock upon which to continue the lineage. That's not a word of condemnation. Please don't receive it that way. It is just actually a fact. It is just time for us to be able to align ourselves, even with that little bit of poetic license that I took there with Mary and Hannah and Joachim, but I didn't take it at all with Lois and Eunice, because they are right there, and they are named for their influence upon a young man by the name of Timothy, who would continue the great mission of God by being a great evangelist and spreader of the gospel. So on a day like today, in fact, every day, it is important for us to understand where we came from. Oh, I remember the Fitzpatrick and Hamilton battles in our home when I was just a kid, when my dad, representing perhaps the stricter side of the family, would say I couldn't do something, and then my mom, who was also a wonderful Christian, she would just look for the way in which I could end up getting to do what I needed to do. It wasn't that it put tension between them. They were just coming from different places. But I will never forget the love and the teaching of my mother and her mother, my dad and his mother. My grandparents were believers, great believers, people who wanted the very best for their offspring and their offspring's offspring. And oh, my friends, those are special. Isaiah 66 verse 13 says, as a mother comforts her child, so will I comfort you. So to Lois and Eunice, and if you would dare to go that little distance to say to Mary and to Hannah, thank you for your motherhood, that not only physically brought another human being into this world, but continued to set the example that resulted in recognizable traits, certainly in Jesus, but also in young Timothy, who, when Paul finished his race, would continue with the great gospel. William Runyon, who lived from 1870 to 1957, somewhere in that period of time, he wrote these words based on the scripture that I actually just quoted a few moments ago from Isaiah 66. Here are those words, and they are a tribute on this Mother's Day. Like as a mother comforteth, O words of gentle worth, so will I comfort you, declares the Lord of all the earth. He bends in faithful watchfulness, he slumbers not nor sleeps. Above his trusting child, the Lord a constant vigil keeps. He patient is, as mothers are, who love their children well. Our faults and failings he forgives, his mercies who can tell? Like as a mother grant, O God, this likeness e'er may be, a holy symbol to declare the love that dwells in thee. A happy Mother's Day to you all on this 9th day of May, 2021. God bless. We'll look forward to talking to you again next week. Bye for now.